When was the 30 Years' War?
Brought to you by Everything Peace of Westphalia.
When was the 30 Years' War? It is easy enough to find out that it took place between 1618 and 1648. But what does that mean? Did they fight like knights with swords and armor? Or were the armies like the lines of redcoats that fought against the American colonies? Was diplomacy marked by monarchs meeting in great pavilions, or diplomats and wigs scratching out notes with quill pens? This video will give you some sense of what the period 1618 to 1648 was like, so you have a bit more context to help understand the war going on during these years. Since our target period is defined by a war, let's start out with the nature of combat. Was it medieval or modern? It was modern in one sense. They did use firearms. The main combat weapon was the matchlock musket, which fired a very powerful bullet, but was slow to load and unreliable. Consequently, they also still fought with the medieval weapon, the pike. Muskets were devastating to large bodies of troops, but they fired too slowly to stop a cavalry charge, so some portion of infantry, usually varying between 1/3 and 2/3, with a tendency to decrease over the course of the war, carried long pikes that could resist a charge. Cavalry were armed with a variety of weapons: wheellock pistols, sabers, lances, and swords. This was the only arm that still used swords much. Officers carried them, as they continued to do into the 20th century, but they were for personal defense rather than the battlefield. Officers and cavalry also continued to wear plate armor, but few still used the full suit in the image of a knight in shining armor. Instead, they mostly wore breastplates to cover the main part of their bodies, and sometimes open helmets. So warfare was clearly moving away from the Middle Ages in this period. On the other hand, you wouldn't see long lines of redcoats fighting as in the Revolutionary War, for three reasons. 1. England only participated briefly in the 30 Years' War. 2. Thin lines of infantry were a product of a period after pikes had been phased out. And 3. Governments did not have the money to buy matching uniforms for their soldiers. It was rare that they had enough cash on hand to keep them adequately fed, much less paid and clothed. Battles of the period look like scrums between motley forces that are difficult to distinguish from one another, not the brightly colored affairs of a century later. Battles were important, but were often secondary to sieges. A siege was an attempt to capture a fortified town, but it didn't look like in the Middle Ages, with high walls and towers at every corner. Those defenses would have collapsed quickly when attacked by artillery, but engineers had devised a new kind of fortress using low walls of packed earth that was much less vulnerable. These defenses made projecting bastions that gave fortifications a characteristic star shape. Attackers generally approached a fortress with such defenses and stocked with adequate artillery through the slow process of trench building until they could get close enough to storm the town. To return to the Revolutionary War comparison, the redcoats did not exist during the 30 Years' War, and the American colonies that they fought against in the Revolutionary War were just getting started. Jamestown was founded in 1607 and was still the capital of Virginia, and Plymouth in 1620. Half of the colonies had not been founded by the time the war ended, and two of the ones that did exist were owned by foreign powers, Delaware by Sweden and New York by the Dutch Republic. England's colonial empire was only just beginning. The big colonial powers were Spain and Portugal, which were part of the same nation until Portugal rebelled from Spain in 1640. They were both on the defensive, however. The Dutch Republic was rapidly becoming the dominant colonial power, capturing many territories in this period, especially from the Portuguese. Even though New World products had been available in Europe for over a century by the time of the 30 Years' War, their use was not widespread. North America's settlers embraced corn, but it did not catch on in Europe, where it was considered an animal feed, an attitude that persists in places today. Tomatoes were viewed as a decoration more than a food. Potatoes would become a major European crop after 1700, but in the early 17th century, turnips were still the major root vegetable. Chocolate was almost exclusively drunk, and only by elites who could afford it. Tea and coffee, two old-world colonial imports, were just starting to be adopted widely in Europe. In fact, the first tea houses and coffee houses opened in Paris and London in the 1650s, just after the 30 Years' War. Most people, even the wealthy, drank beer or wine. This was the age of Galileo, Bacon, Descartes, and Pascal. Some of the greatest minds in history were bringing about a scientific revolution. For the first half of the 17th century, however, this meant breakthrough ideas, but not many practical applications yet. It was during the 30 Years' War that William Harvey discovered that the heart circulates blood through the body, but this was of limited practical value because no one knew why. Bleeding a patient was still the most common form of treatment, and surgery was largely limited to amputations, performed by barber surgeons, who, yes, also cut people's hair. Major medical advances would not come until after the invention of the microscope in the 1660s. Pocket watches had existed for a century, but were so inaccurate that many did not bother to use a minute hand. It was not until Christian Huygens and Robert Boyle came up with the balance spring in the 1650s that watches became useful rather than mainly decorative. Huygens also made clocks more affordable and accurate with his discovery of the principle of the pendulum around the same time. The barometer was invented toward the end of the 30 Years' War. In 1644, Torricelli first demonstrated the principle of using a liquid in a sealed tube to measure pressure, and Blaise Pascal designed an experiment in 1648 that demonstrated that Torricelli's explanation was correct. Because the barometer created a vacuum in the tube, it presented a major challenge to mainstream science, which denied the possibility of a vacuum. The challenge to the scientific establishment convinced Torricelli not to publish his findings, out of fear that he might be punished for unorthodoxy. He had reason to be concerned. His predecessor as chairman of mathematics at the University of Pisa was Galileo, who had been condemned by the Inquisition in 1633. But it was not just Catholic states that put advanced thinkers in danger. The great Dutch thinker Hugo Grotius, author of The Law of War and Peace, was imprisoned for religious heterodoxy in 1618, and only escaped death by being smuggled out of the Dutch Republic by sympathizers. Scientific advances probably contributed to the decline of alchemy and magic, but this wasn't always obvious in the early 17th century when Europe was experiencing its last great witchcraft panics. They lasted a little longer in the New World, the last big one occurring in Salem, Massachusetts in 1692. The art of the 17th century broke sharply with the balance and harmony of the Renaissance. The new style, characterized by its direct appeal to a viewer's emotions, was later dubbed Baroque. This sculpture showing the ecstasy of St. Teresa reflects an entirely new level of emotional intensity. The contrast between Michelangelo's Statue of David and the version by Bernini is often used to illustrate the change. This is the age of Van Dyck, Rembrandt, Velázquez, and Rubens, painters who use new techniques such as diagonal compositions, lush color, and individuals who engage the viewer directly. Fashion became more playful, with loose sleeves, cocked hats, and ostrich feathers. Men wore their hair longer, sometimes with a lovelock over their left shoulder. The lovelock was often braided and was intended to show devotion to a loved one. Extravagant powdered wigs would become common in the second half of the 17th century, but were still rare during the 30 Years' War. Meanwhile, the gaudy cartwheel ruffs of the late 16th century had gone out of style, except in the Dutch Republic. It was like a period of sanity between two eras of affectation. People still wore fancy collars, either falling over the shirt or held up by a wire frame. An increasing number were made of lace, a 15th century invention that was coming into widespread adoption. Many fashion trends in this period, as before and afterward, were started by monarchs. In most countries, the king or queen was the focus of government. Writers developed a theory of absolutism that put all the power in the hands of the monarch, but this also meant an increasing burden of responsibility for the individuals who were supposed to direct their nations. The age is full of very talented kings and queens. Sigismund III of Poland was a painter, one of whose works was mistaken for a Tintoretto into modern times. Philip IV of Spain translated Guicciardini. Emperor Ferdinand III was the first of a series of gifted Habsburg composers. Nor were their abilities just spent on pastimes, as the numerous reforms of Christian IV of Denmark and Gustavus Adolphus show. However, being an active ruler was exhausting and dangerous for the few who actually went to war like their ancestors. Gustavus was killed in battle, and Christian IV lost an eye. It was understandable that most monarchs preferred to stay away from combat. Many tried to avoid administrative work too, ruling through a favorite who did most of the actual work, men such as Cardinal Richelieu, the Count of Olivares, or the Duke of Buckingham. Diplomacy, like war, was carried out mostly by proxy. Instead of grand meetings between monarchs, treaties were negotiated by duly authorized representatives. In some countries, monarchies came close to the absolutist ideal of an individual who ruled by the grace of God and not by the consent of anyone else. In France, for example, the representative body known as the Estates General met in 1614, the last time before it would convene in 1789 to inaugurate the French Revolution. Other assemblies, such as those in Denmark and Russia, declined later in the 17th century. But kings didn't have things all their own way. Parliament fought back against King Charles I of England. After a civil war, they beheaded him in 1649. One of the driving forces of the 30 Years' War was this struggle between representative assemblies and monarchs, which played out in one kingdom after another.